Hi, I'm Seb and I make stuff. Today I'm going to be showing you how I made this display piece, a diorama based on the Book of Boba Fett, to show off some of my 3D models from Skullforge Studios and RavenX. So I got this image here from some promotional material, did a quick sketch of what I wanted to build, and then pulled out the foam board. The first thing to do with foam board is tear off this paper layer. So peel into the corner and tear away. And hopefully you've got a decent quality foam board, because sometimes this stuff is really hard to peel away. Now I'm going to take that sketch I did earlier and start drawing it out onto the board using a miniature for scale. Not without a few interruptions. And now where was I? So I'm going to use a steel ruler and a nice long slow cut to try and get the straightest edge that I can. But I'm being a little bit lazy and get some wonky edges anyway. Now using a leftover door from a previous build, I'm going to make a scale for my archways. And then begin cutting these out before adding a cleaner edge to the curve. Now to add to depth, I'm going to add a second layer. So I will use this piece as a template to get them roughly the same size, and then I will be sticking these together with a little bit of distance to add a bit of parallax movement and depth. Using my miniature for scale, once again, I'm going to cut out a little bit of a edgeway that is poking out by the front of these doors. I'm just stacking up multiple layers in a fairly roughly similar shape, as I do plan on covering all of this later on, so a bit of rough edging doesn't really matter too much for now. Now using a cutoff that still has the paper on one edge, I'm going to bend this piece and curve it into the right shape to go across the top of this door, adding some super glue and sticking it down right away. Then trimming off some extra bits and pieces to add a few of the smaller details to this wall. Now using some of this thicker rubbish styrofoam, I'm going to add that depth that I was talking about earlier. So these extra pillars will stick between the two and then have a nice flat piece to close off the top. Before cleaning up the edges and gluing the whole thing down to a base piece of styrofoam. And referring back to that original image, around the base of each of these pillars there is a little bit of extra detail. So I just stuck on an extra layer of foam before coating the entire model in a fairly thick layer of white gesso. Really adding it on thick wherever I wanted to fill in some gaps, as well as really making a good effort to get it into the deeper crevices of the model, to use this as a kind of primer to help protect the whole model from spray paint later on, as spray paint can melt foam, and this is a very painful lesson to learn after you've finished a build. Once this layer is dry, I came in with a scalpel and carved out some detail into the extra extruding pieces of foam. Once I had the basic detail carved in with the sharp part of the blade, I went around the whole thing with a toothpick, running it through the gaps to really help deepen and thicken up this detailing. I decided that I needed a bit of a thicker render to cover up some of the gaps in the design of the foam build. So I took some of the white gesso and added in some grout. I then used a piece of scrap foam to apply a thick layer of this all over the area that I wanted to cover up my mistakes, using a nice thick layer and then coming in with the flat edge of the foam to smooth it out. Then to do the same thing onto a few more of the extra details before adding a layer of render over the entire wall. I found that smoothing this out with my fingers was the best way to get a nice natural smooth finish and easiest way to get into the edges. Now, using my door again for scale, I'm going to carve out a bit of an entryway that will sit in the deeper recesses of the diorama. And now to add some of that signage that makes this distinctly Tatooine. We have a layer across the top and a couple of deeper layers that will go besides the door. I've printed out a screenshot from this promotional material and cut out the signs to copy a rough design of this lettering by again using the blade of my scalpel to carve in the original shape and then coming in later on with a toothpick to thicken this up. And repeating the same process on a couple of these larger pieces that will go next to the doors. So cutting in some basic lettering and then thickening up all of these deeper grooves with a toothpick, before hot gluing all of these designs onto the walls. And once they're all in place, giving them a quick layer of the white gesso just to help them all maintain the same texture as the rest of the building. One final protective coat before we paint the whole thing. A mix of Mod Podge, water and a little bit of black paint just to help us make sure we've covered everything up. And this way we can make sure it's safe when we come in with our first layer of grey primer spray paint. Once the whole thing has a good layer of the grey primer, I'm going to come in with the Citadel Wraithbone White to give it a little bit of a zenithal highlight from above, just to help separate some of the colours and give us a few different bases to work from. Now that the whole model has got a nice priming layer, we're going to put some Mod Podge or glue all over the base, spread it out nice and evenly, and then cover the entire thing with sand. And now here's a lesson. The sand that I collected was a little bit wet, so when it dried it kind of stuck together and did not give me the right kind of base that I wanted at all. I had to really loosen up all of the extra bits and pieces, scrape away at everything and soften up the edges, and come back in and give it another layer in the end. Once I was happy with this, I gave the entire thing a coat in a Tamiya light sand spray paint. Eventually the sand dried with an almost wet, muddy sand look, but we want a dry desert. So I coated the whole thing in a layer of quick grip glue, let this set to become nice and tacky, and then this time using nice and dry sand, I coated the entire model's base, giving this 5 to 10 minutes to dry off before pouring away all of the excess. This had a much better look, and I helped hold everything in place with a quick matte sealant. Now we had a nice sandy base, it was time to add some weathering. So using some Agrax Earth Shade, I came in quite heavily and really spread this out over all of these deep recesses, making sure to spread it nice and wide before coming in with some paper towel and wiping away the excess. This gives a nice, deeper, dirty, darker look to these models while not taking away from the paint job that you've already done. Also dry brushing the Agrax Earth Shade into any of the areas of the model that I feel like a shadow would be getting cast. And then repeating the process across any of the other deeper recesses. And now that the base is built, it's time to add some details. So by referring back to the original image, I'm going to try and find or build some of these designs. I had a quick look on Thingiverse to see if I could find anything that would fill in the bits. I had a little bit of luck, but I couldn't find quite the right thing for those major light pieces. So I decided to jump over to Tinkercad and design them myself. Being a super simple model of a handful of cylinders crossed over one another, and with a couple of different variations for the top of the piece, this was a quick 5-minute build that had me with the exact piece that I wanted. So after preparing a handful of these, as well as some vents that I found on Thingiverse, I threw some nice clear resin into my printer and got them printing.
5 hours later.
And we have our models. I also decided to print out some of these Gamorrean guard from RavenX. After a quick cleanup and UV cure, we can hit these guys with a grey primer, and then come in with a layer of Citadel Wraithbone White. Now that we have all of our Greeblies printed and primed, it's time to start painting them and getting them ready for our diorama. After a quick dry fit to make sure that everything's going to sit where I want it, I grab my paints out and get started. First off with a black Templar contrast onto any of the dark metal sections, before going to my reference image and deciding to go with a pure silver for most of these extra fixtures. Then using the mostly dried out brush to give a nice dry brush effect over the already blacked out base door. A cheap black primer and a quick dry brush of silver can really give you a nice metallic effect. And now moving on to a few of these extra fixtures, which I'm going to base in silver before gluing together and leaving the center part white. And then adding a nice bright yellow to these lamps that hang in the archways before dry brushing a sandy colour over these bits of greeblies that sit at the front. Then dry brushing some silver over the black vent before coming in with a bronze colour over some of these extra lamps. And once I was happy with all of these little bits and pieces, it was time to glue everything down. So, one piece at a time, constantly referring to my reference image, I stuck everything exactly where it should be. And now with one last reference to my image, I decided to add a little bit more weathering around the place, add a little bit of something extra to these details around the base, and my final little detail of a control panel for the door. One of the more fiddly bits of painting that I've done for a while. But is it really a Star Wars door if it doesn't have a little control panel with some bright buttons and lights on the side? So I added these in using a Flash Gits yellow, a Cantor blue, and a Mephiston red. Before very carefully adding a few drops of super glue and placing this right next to the door. And there we go, finished with our display piece diorama based on the Book of Boba Fett. A nice little piece to go on my shelf to show off these 3D miniatures from Skullforge Studios and RavenX. I'll do my best to link all of the models that I used in the description, and I'll be uploading my little Greebly design onto Thingiverse. Let me know what you'd like to see me build next, and I'll see you next time on Seb Makes Stuff.